Our first speaker today, I actually, before I talk about the first speaker, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be here, how much I appreciate being invited to attend and to listen to everyone. I've learned a lot. My field is rather different. I work on architectural theory in the early modern period, but it's gotten me to think the questions that we've been raising about dematerialization have gotten me to think also about even Renaissance architectural theory in different ways already. So I look forward to more conversation today and to hearing the papers. Our first speaker is Monika Wagner. She's from the University of Hamburg, and her paper is going to be titled Dust and Smoke, Volatile Materials in Contemporary Art. And Monika studied painting at Kassel, so she comes to us from a studio art background first. Then she studied art history, as well as archaeology and literary studies in Hamburg and also London. She was an assistant at the University of Tübingen, and she headed the radio collective Modern Art and taught art history from 1987 to 2010 at the University of Hamburg. She has published mainly on the painting between the 18th and the 20th centuries, and on the history and theory of perception, one of my favorite subjects. And here she's focusing also on the importance of material in art, especially in the 20th century. So, thank you.
Well, first of all, I would like to thank Professor Baus very much for the invitation. I really enjoyed being here, and thank you so much for the warm words. When about 30 years ago, I started to investigate in the materials and the materiality of art, and material was not a category at that time, so I'm not prepared to give it up. And I slightly, let me see, changed my title. Yeah. I hope I will be able to start that. Yeah, thank you. For dematerializations, materials are required. In a literal and a physical sense, dust and smoke are the results of decompositions of materials, of objects or beings. Both are volatile and lack stable shapes. While smoke is not directly tangible, though you can feel, smell and see it, the ubiquitous dust could even be grasped. Smoke is a specific kind of dust. Its particles result from the burning of materials and fill the air, but have not yet settled. When smoke dissolves, its fallout becomes dust, and depending on the material which has been consumed, the resulting rests can be very different. And about these rests I'm going to talk, not so much about the air filled with the smoke. Both dust and smoke are considered as something impure and dirty. In the hierarchy of materials, dust ranks as useless residue, literally as having dropped to the lowest level, and is considered to be an extremely poor substance. This is already verified in the patristic literature with its scaling from dust to gold. Similar to many other low-coded materials with no specific artistic tradition, but with unusual properties, dust and smoke became a challenge in the 20th century art. The material transfer meaning from their everyday life into the artistic sphere. Now I take you back to the early 20th century for a moment to build up a little background of what happened later on, and I will specifically go then to the 1980s and 90s. It would not be exaggerated to claim that the first 2 decades of the 20th century were highlighted by concepts of what you could call dematerializations, but I would put it in question marks. No, in quotation marks, I'm sorry. But dust and smoke were not the kind of dematerialization the avant-garde of the early 20th century pursued. On the contrary, the modernists considered the world of the 19th century, which they wanted to leave behind, as dusty. In the words of Walter Benjamin, the old days seemed to be caught in a dust trap, in einer Staubfalle gefangen. Instead, avant-garde artists pursued a different strategy of dematerialization. Transparency was the counter-term to the dustiness, for instance, of historicistic architecture, and glass was its medium. I quote, "No material overcomes matter to such an extent as glass does," the expressionist art critic Adolf Behne declared. Accordingly, Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, in the last picture of his Bauhaus book entitled From Material to Architecture, which appeared in 1929, published Jan Kamen's photograph of two superimposed negatives evoking two interacting architectural structures. Moholy-Nagy announced it as the permeation of architectural spaces which future generations might witness. New methods of producing hitherto unseen panels of crystal glass approximated the concept of a dematerialized architecture. Though Moholy-Nagy did not use the term immaterial before his American publications, his arguments as well as his artistic works aimed at something like that. Many contemporaries argued in the same direction, describing a new type of material world. Just to name a few, German writer Josef Adolf Lux praised the tendency towards dematerialization and abstraction. He calls it Entmaterialisieren und Abstraktion. Russian architect and painter Alexander Vesnin propagated materialized energy, and Elisitsky used Hegel's expression immaterial materiality. All these ideas, and I could add a few more, of what we might call dematerialization, were concerned with purity and transparency and centered around light, new technologies, and new materials. In several aspects, Jean-François Lyotard's famous exhibition from 1985, with its trend-setting title Les Matériaux, interlinking new technologies with artworks, including light installations of Moholy-Nagy and then Flevin, delineated a continuation of concepts of future-orientated dematerializations. Interestingly, and for me this is very important, Lyotard's exhibition was originally going to be named Les Matériaux dans tous ses états, a notion which I prefer and consider as a very helpful instrument for description. But the title Les Matériaux was certainly more effective and ennobled the new media with a divine aura. In the 1920s, we find few opponents to the euphoric plea for clean and hygienic forms of dematerializations. One of them was Georges Bataille, who in his Dictionnaire critique at the end of the 1920s mocked of the dust phobia of the New Age. He believed that in spite of all the chambermaids and servants with their new electric vacuum cleaners, dust on the long run will win. Walter Benjamin, as well as Siegfried Cracow, argued that the new class architecture will not preserve any traces of dust and will therefore remain free from any history. It was Marcel Duchamp who opposed to the dogma of transparency, precisely demonstrating that even glass is subject to getting dusty. He contaminated the modernist clearing in allowing the dust to settle on a glass panel as a visible trace of passing time. Dust breeding took half a year, with the dust accumulating on the glass panel of the unfinished picture which the artist had left lying on the floor of his New York studio while traveling in Europe. The avant-garde ideal of gloss, transparency, and immateriality embodied in glass thus turned opaque and dirty. Man Ray sort of fixed the ephemeral dust breeding in a photograph so that the ephemeral and irregular and fluffy texture of the loose dust appeared on the glossy surface of the photo. When published in 1921, uncropped and with captions in the surrealist magazine Literature, it provided an extraterrestrial view of a planet made of dust. And I'll show you the original publication here with this white field on the top, which is normally cropped. For the time being, Duchamp's dust breeding figured as a singular intervention in the overall de-dusting campaign of modernity. As Duchamp's dust breeding shows, dust in comparison to the increasingly powerful field of clean dematerializations in the concept of progress belongs to an opposite concept. As particles of something existing prior to them, dust and smoke are conceived as the material epitome of traces of something which is no longer there. They are basically retrospective. As materials, they demonstrate entropic dynamics. The chemist Justus Liebig recognized this in the middle of the 19th century by mentioning, I quote, "Dust contains on a small scale everything that has surrounded us. It is a material archive of what existed." Since memory, and now I make it's a big gap, I jump into the much later time. I want to have that as a sort of background. Since memory and the archive became major concepts in the humanities during the 1980s, many artists contributed by using dust as a material directly connected with the debris and deconstruction and annihilation. However, the strategies of the artists involved, they're highly different, and I just give you a few hints. Agnes Denisch, she was mentioned yesterday already, for instance, in her Book of Dust from 1989 evokes cosmic dimensions of death and rebirth by her spirals of stardust. And the American photographer David Meisel instead documented in his Library of Dust the shocking archive of the Oregon State Hospital for Psychiatry, where the cremated remains of more than 3,000 patients who died at the hospital between 1883 and the 1970s were stored in copper cans. The calcinated ashes reacted with the copper and produced a horribly beautiful color patina on the surface of the metal. Here, the credibility of the institution, and that is the Oregon State Hospital, in combination with the documentary dimension of photography, are fundamental. Other artists use dust as a physically visible witness of historic incidents or disasters, as did Xu Bing in his Dust Project, referring to 9/11. The Chinese artist who lives in New York City, according to his own statement, collected dust of the collapsed Twin Towers in the streets of Lower Manhattan after the attack of 2001. In his dust project, he applies the collected dust for the materialization of a text which centers around emptiness. As there is nothing from the first, where does the dust itself collect? The quotation derives from a translated Zen poem from the 8th century. In his exhibitions on different continents, Xu Bing fixes enlarged typescript letters which are cut out from cardboard and form the text onto the gallery floors. Then he dissipates the grayish dust from the New York streets into the gallery space using a converted leaf blower. He allows the dust to settle for 24 hours and then removes the stencils. This long sedimentation process is important for the very powdery surface texture, since the finest dust settles latest. The text appears in negative letters showing the gallery floor beneath. Without the information about the origin of the dust, the text from the Zen poem remains a general, more or less mysterious statement. The textual information about the origin of the dust placed at the entrance of the gallery space seems to be essential for the work and gives it a more specific meaning, for which the dust is regarded as a physical evidence. Though there is no proof, since the origin of the dust cannot be verified by the spectator, its physical presence operates like a contact relic. Not without this information provided by the artist, be it true or not, does the mutual authentication of the syntax and the material work as authentication, which has a long tradition in Christian religious practices. This is significant for the staging and exposing of testimony and credibility in the arts at the end of the 20th century. Regarding the nature of the dust, it becomes evident that other dusts circulating in the gallery space settles on the dust from the Twin Towers. Dust cannot be kept pure, since it's everywhere and constantly increases. Some artists, like Dieter Kiesling, have been engaged in showing what is raised by the beholder moving in the exhibition space and being projected with a camera and a beamer. So the more people are in this gallery space, the denser the projection of the dust becomes. Others, like the Taiwanese artist Yuxing Chang, collected dust from the air filtration system of the Museum of Modern Art and with the aid of glue reshaped it in a monstrous hanging sculpture. So that means reshaping something and bringing it into this circular motion. For laymen, the origin of dust has always been a mystery. But since the 1830s, the sciences began systematically to study dust in order to analyze the composition of its particles and trace back their origins. As shown in the micrographs of Christian Gottfried Ehrenberg, one of the major actors and founder of microbiology, dust particles prove to be extremely different in their shapes and materiality. Equipped with large microscopes, Ehrenberg analyzed, for instance, dust collected in the sails of ships such as Charles Darwin's Beagle in order to understand where and what the minute particles derived from. And here is one of these glass fiolen sent from the Beagle. Thus, the wind flows, such as the trade winds, could be studied. In thousands of minute micrographs, Ehrenberg shows the chaotic mixture of ingredients under the microscopic lens. Next to the micrographs, he placed the same ingredients classified by morphological criteria. Such illustrations were extremely popular during the late 19th century and prompted caricatures because the different dust particles invisible to the human eyes seemed intriguingly unreal. And maybe Barbara Kruger still transfers the hunting for dust grains in everyday context, stating that it is a small world, but not if you have to clean it. A sort of caricature of the mania of scientific documentation is to be found as well in Ilya Kabakov's installation entitled Dustman from 1988. Kabakov took up the meticulous way of labeling the origins of the tiny particles of waste by precisely doing the same what scientists had done with the aim of classifying their collected material. On the labels, Kabakov inscribed the type of material and the exact place and date where and when the dust particle was found. The scientific method which the artist applied without pursuing a reasonable target becomes absurd. That is exactly what the artist was after, double affirmation as a method which denotes itself. His procedure refers to the Soviet control system, which Kabakov, during the time he lived in Moscow, was constantly exposed to, as he had to precisely document day by day everything he took from and to his studio. But here, no longer things but matter and dust are filed, a measurement of control which turns into the exact opposite. So what I wanted to show with these examples is that they always have their reference in an everyday frame. While Kabakov and the other before mentioned artists argue with the assumed authenticity of the dust from a certain site or incident, the Italian artist Claudio Parmigiani does not. Neither relics nor authentic debris are of interest. Instead, he works with the source of the smoke, which was set free by a fire right in the gallery space. In his shadow library entitled Polvere, which the artist performed since the late 1970s in several locations, Parmigiani shows something absent. What we see is not the dust of former books, not the rest of their destruction, but shadow-like imprints. The artist himself spoke of delocazione, which seems to be an adequate description, since the books and the shelves were there, but they have been removed, leaving their more or less precise traces in the walls. It is the notion of the trace, as Georges Didier-Übermann has argued in his essay Abdruck and Staub, Imprint and Dust, which evokes the dimensions of lost. Imprints are specific forms of dematerialization. In Parmigianino's Delocazione, the imprints appear in the soot of the smoke settled on the walls. The latter may be called dust, but it does not derive from the books itself, as I said, which were not destroyed, though this might be suggested at first glance. Instead, the artist burned car tires in front and well-filled bookshelves. Car tires made of vulcanized caoutchouc produce enormous volumes of black smoke, as can be seen in street fights all over the world when protesters use them as barricades. Parmigiani's procedure implies that the burning must have occurred right here in that place. This is why I termed it as being a performance. The suddenness and directness of the action of burning is preserved in the traces of thus and contributes to the uncanniness of the work. This becomes evident in comparison with a different type of delocazione, which evokes completely different associations. Austrian artist and experimentator Erwin Wurm, in the late 1980s, created a series of dust sculptures. He, like Parmigiani, removed things and exposed the traces they left behind. But different from Parmigiani, Wurm deliberately positioned himself beyond the pathos of the memory context, which is easily evoked by the paradigm of the absent, which had been intensively discussed during the 1980s. And we heard yesterday already the references of Pierre Nora, Jan Assmann, and Young. The traces in Wurm's dust sculptures seem to be documents of passing time, though the artist produced them in time-lapse motion and sold certificates with demystifying instructions to produce them quickly. With a certificate of dust piece without title from 1989, Wurm gives a demystifying instruction of how to make the dust. I quote, "Take the dust of a vacuum cleaner and put it into a t-shirt. Hold back circa 30 centimeters over the pedestal and start beating the bottom of the bag with the other hand. While doing it, go always round the pedestal. The dust should look like the amount of dust which is falling naturally in approximately 2 weeks." Unquote. However, the fluffy texture of the loose material still suggests time passing gradually. The soothe of a fire in Parmigiani's work imply a completely different violence, which in the context of the memory discourses almost involuntarily evoked the connection to the burning books. On a far more abstract level, Czech artist Magdalena Jettelova, in her installation Time Present, Time Past, which was first installed in 1991, created an immersive room suited from smoke. The room created the experience of interacting time concepts of suddenness and of time passing. All 4 walls of the exhibition space were blackened from burnt acetylene, which produces enormous amounts of smoke from a highly soothing flame. The burning took place in the floor within the space, as one can see in the gradually brightening from the blackness on the floor level to the irregular grayish tints on the upper end. All 4 walls on which the soot of the smoke has settled show handwritten scriptures on the wall. In endless repetition, but in varying distinctness, the following text by T.S. Eliot appears. Time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past, unquote. Jettelova confronted the archaic process of handwriting with an intense red laser writing of the same text. Due to the unstable material, the intense darkness next to the floor where the acetylene was burned, and the different pressure of the hand, the writing is only partly legible, while the articulate laser text constantly moves over the handwritten text. The words appearing with red letters seem to be permanently written, namely from right to left by an invisible hand, and are subsequently dissolving. Each letter added at the left side corresponds to a cancellation on the right side. Thus, the interweaving of different time layers occurred not only in the semantics of the text, but in the materiality of the writing as well. While the dirty handwriting shows a self-contained process which may be retraced by the beholder, the clean laser text demands permanent attention for the present moment. The different materializations of the text, the energy of the light and the entropic dimension of the dust interact in their different temporalities within the same space. This appears to me as a promising option for, at that time, for les matériaux dans tous ses états. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monika. Our next speaker is Filip Lipiński, who comes to us from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznań. He's assistant professor at the Institute of Art History of that university, and he studied art history and English philology. He's interested in contemporary art and culture and art in the United States, as I know, as we talked about the other day. He's the author of the book Virtual Hopper, and published a piece of that in the Oxford Art Journal. And also he's published in Art-Investigaciones and the Reha Journal. And today his talk is titled The Work of Virtual. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And now I'll be speaking on my own behalf, not Marta's. I just need to actually change the presentation to put it before, but it was a wrong version, as it usually happens. So, my apologies. Okay. Oh, I have to put it on the computer. Bo chyba muszę przełożyć na komputer, prawda? Żeby to było... Aha. O, zrobimy wtedy. Dobra. Dlaczego tego nie... I see that. Jest. A, z PDF, tak? Już, tak? Tak. Czekaj, muszę zrobić tak. Okay. So, I would like to have a look at a lot of different issues. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me. This is a nice opportunity to talk about things that seem to be quite pivotal these days, even though we're trying to historicize the notion of dematerialization or materiality. And my talk is looking at the notion of materiality from slightly different, or actually radically different perspective, because I would like to introduce into the whole discussion the notion of the virtual, which seems to be the opposite of the material, but it is not necessarily so. And I'd like to apologize for a certain part, especially the second part of my talk, won't be, well, at least it will seem as not really properly historicized, because first of all, for the sake of the brevity, and on the other hand, also because I think of this paper more as a kind of a heuristic exercise into thinking the virtual. So, in this paper, I wish to examine the question of a complex relationship between the virtual and the material in already formed work of art, and I will discuss I will focus on diverse manifestations or actualizations of the virtual, which in this particular talk, I call the work of the virtual. Following scholars such as Wolfgang Welsh and Brian Masumi, I contend that the virtual should not be considered the opposite of the material or real, but as its complementary or supplementary element, which nonetheless complicates the questions of presence, both in ontological and temporal sense, of unity, wholeness, and materiality. Hence also, in a way, in a general sense of the meaning of the term of dematerialization. The virtual should be regarded in a, well, I believe, in twofold manner. On the one hand, as an unreleased and unspecified potential of a kind of formless energy residing in material objects ready to be actualized. On the other hand, the virtual in action or at work should be considered as the virtual should be considered as the virtual in action or at work, as an already actualized entity, still immaterial, residing or appearing as or in memory, dream work, phantasmatic projection, all of which are imperfectly mediated through verbal description, technological mediation, or in more recent art, more specifically digital imagery, for instance. Art, through its indeterminate meaning, generative, often excessive forms, which invite special kind of reception, is especially prone to extend beyond its material structure into the domain of the virtual. The virtual constitute an extended field of a given material artwork, a field between the object and the subject of perception, through which an artwork literally or metaphorically touches the viewer. Its status in relation to the work of art is supplementary or paragonal in the sense proposed by Jacques Derrida. The virtual both belongs to the material and seems external to it. It resides within an art object and enfolds it as a result of a negotiation between the object and the subject or the viewer, the interactor, who is an agent activating its potential in a process of perception, visual or otherwise. The word virtual describes an ephemeral ontology of something that is as good as, or almost the same, but at the same time implies physical non-existence. Recently, it's been mostly associated with new technologies of communication and imagining. Here I'm more interested in its philosophical, often forgotten sense. Etymologically, virtual is related to the Latin virtus, meaning virtue, strength, or potency. Dictionary definitions indicate that it designated, and I quote, a power of acting without the agency of matter, that is functionally or effectively, but not formally of its kind. The term has its counterpart in Aristotle's notion of dynamis, meaning both potential and power to act, formulated by ancient Romans as potentia and virtus. They were synonymous. It became a philosophical notion in its own right with St. Thomas Aquinas, who used the term virtual as a synonym for potential, something which does not explicitly appear, but is a locus of real power or efficacy. Over the following centuries, the meaning fluctuated from its ontological aspects to an epistemological dimension, for example, in Leibniz's writings. However, its most important formulation was made by Henri Bergson, who used the notion of the virtual to describe the material domain of memory in general, which gets actualized in perception by external visual stimuli. And I quote, "In fact," he wrote, "there is no perception which is not full of memories. With the immediate and present data of our senses, we mingle 1,000 details out of our past experience," end of quote. Memory always transforms perception because the remembered images struggle with perceived ones. As a result, and I quote Bergson again, perception is never a mere contact of the mind with the object, with the object present. It's impregnated with memory images which complete it as they interpret it. End of quote. If we agree that perception, including tactile or other sensory experience, is conditioned by its object, then the least we can do is to acknowledge that the virtual sphere activated in the process is one of negotiation between the object and the perceiving subject reacting to it. If post-structuralist theory, these days often unjustly, in my opinion, discounted as reductive textualism, gave more power or agency to the latter, that is the subject, the reader, viewer, I wish to emphasize the power of the object, which holds much control over what it generates. In his important commentaries on Bergson, Gilles Deleuze stressed the creatively differential and temporally complex nature of this mechanism. The actualized potential of the virtual has a transformative power, returning or retouching the object of its origin via the mediating body of the perceiving subject. Diverse ways of response to a work of art, an artwork, result in an intermediary sphere in which the virtual gets actualized in the form of language, images, or even bodily reactions it triggers, no matter how elusive they seem to be. In the field of art history, the Deleuzian differential and creative aspect of the virtual were noticed by Dario Gamboni. In his book Potential Images, Gamboni analyzes ambiguity and indeterminacy located in the great number of works of art, mostly paintings and sculptures. He admitted that he could easily call his book Virtual Images, but he preferred to avoid association with, I quote, developments in information technology. Works he analyzes act as sources of multiple readings, which, due to their structural and material qualities, such as painterly blobs and sculptural material getting in the way of figuration, cannot be simply consumed by the eye and explained in a straightforward manner. Instead, they become a locus of perceptual and, as a result, intellectual tension which exceeds a fixed material form. Potential images, he proposes, quote, became actual during the act of contemplation in a creative way. They are not predetermined. Sorry for the quality of the slide. His initial example is at the beginning of the book, is a colored marble facing of the interior walls of San Marco. Never noticed before as such, the panels in its formal arrangement and its material semi-abstract structure serve as an intermediary between abstract mosaic on the floor and the figurative images in the upper part of the walls and vaults. Their veining colored structure resulting from the quality of the material used are suggestive of diverse motives of, and I quote, waves, skies, flames, and plants, or even animal and human shapes, end of quote. Such discoveries, more often found in actual, seemingly straightforward figurative works, reveal the creative virtuality of potentiality located in images reducible neither to figuration nor abstraction. This movement and tension, kind of amassed energy activated by the viewer, actualize the potentiality of the work, of an artwork. They reveal the work of the virtual caught in its actualized by immaterial, imaginary, or perceptual state of being. Georges de Iberman is another art historian who in his writing addresses the dimension of the virtual in a work of art. He sees the virtual as an aspect of the visual, which goes against established paradigms of art history, and I quote, the word virtual, he wrote, is meant to suggest how the regime of the visual tends to loosen our grip on the normal, let's say, it's in inverted commas, let's say rather habitually adopted conditions of visible knowledge, end of quote. The visual, aligned with the virtual, as opposed to the visible, is a symptom or index of a work, memory, and process. And this is D. Iberman, whose signifying material is first of all the image. The virtual, he continues, designates, and I quote again, designates precisely the sovereign power of that which does not appear visibly. D.D. Iberman does not limit an image to a dematerialized entity or just a mental image, but as he proved in his various compelling analysis, but he's interested in image in its materiality and texture, or including its materiality and texture. Analyzing in his book Confronting Images, is the title of the English translation, Fra Angelico's San Marco Annunciation, he points to the whiteness of the wall dividing the two protagonists between the two protagonists of the scene, which semiotically signifies nothing, is empty. It is, I quote him, paradoxical because virtual. It is the phenomenon of something that does not appear clearly and distinctly, and a symptom of the suddenly manifested knot of arborescence of associations and conflicting meanings. The confrontation with the work delivers the complex skein of a virtual memory, he writes, which is not just the result of our contemporary gaze, but also, he emphasizes, it is integral to the work itself and to the pictorial strategy specific to Fra Angelico, end of quote. It is the undifferentiated blank between the figures covered in white paint that visually opens up the material work to a string of associations and memories going against the tide of received knowledge and disciplinary doxa, and it complicates its presence and meaning. Following the above presented art historical accounts of well, of course, selected, of the virtual, I wish to provide several very diverse and necessarily selected examples of textual or artistic approaches, which, as I propose, reveal the agency of the virtual as well as different ways of locating and mediating it. Perhaps surprisingly, I'll start with a famous description of a Belvedere torso by Johann Joachim Winkelmann, which, due to turmoil of history, was destroyed, lacks head and its extremities, as we know. Winkelmann's interested gaze is translated into an ekphrastic description with a great deal of Aristotelian anargeia, the power of words to evoke images in a human's mind. His description kind of performs a function of a virtual supplement, but not prosthesis, in the sense that it's not supposed to like provide the exact, well, or reconstruct the shape of the sculpture. It sets the hero in motion, as if accompanying the mutilated sculpture with an imaginary projection of its past actions. And I quote Winkelmann here: "Every part of this body reveals, as in a painting, the entire hero in a particular deed," wrote Winkelmann. And then, a first glance, will perhaps allow you to see nothing but an unformed stone. But if you are able to penetrate the secrets of art, then you will see a miracle in it. Then Heracles will appear to you as if he were in the middle of all of his labors, and the hero and the god will simultaneously become visible in this work. His language mediates the effect of this special object on that special object has on the spectator. Keith Moxey, commenting on Bruno Latour's and Laurent Daston's ideas, wrote that, and I quote him, "Language is not a medium which we smear across the surface of reality in order to make it meaningful, but that it is constitutive of the very things to which it refers. Language has a thickness that, while forever distorting that which it describes, nevertheless has the power to bring its referent into being, to give life to what it cannot grasp." End of quote. And yet, as in turn Elizabeth Grosz wrote, we have to settle for the failing language and other forms of symbolization to convey, and I quote, "the flow and mutual investment of material relations into each other, duration, vibration, contractions, and dilations, not contained by the thing or by the intellectual categories." End of quote. There is a quality in the verbal Winkelmann's description, which at least touch upon these issues or the qualities that I just listed. He responds to the emanation of the whole through fragment, through allegorical ruin, as Benjamin commented Winkelmann's text, in front of him, which is in front of him with the scenario of Hercules' actions. It is in the fragment the torso and its material concretization, which compels his imagination to dive into the redeeming sphere of the myth, and it depends on the readers if they decide that Winckelmann's proposition is persuasive or not. While on the one hand, while one way of responding and translating the semiotic and phenomenological potential of a material work of art is language, another, perhaps more effective one, is letting visual associations with actual works of art come into play. Still, they have to be somehow written down or expressed in language, but the initial one is the association. Obviously, individual viewers' associations will vary and will be differently connected to an object of their scrutiny. However, if memory images activated in the process of perception respond to visual and material structure of the object, there is no reason why we should not disavow this virtual archive as a legitimate element, to use W.J.T. Mitchell's formulations, to an element of what the objects wanted or desired. The desire is circumscribed by visual or structural, by visuality or structural elements, structural conditions of the object. And I'll just mention one quite extraordinary example of such a response to a work of art, which is the case of Russian director Sergei Eisenstein, who responded to El Greco's painting, The Expulsion of the Moneylenders from the Temple. The only one that, as he admits in the first sentence of his text, Non-Indifferent Nature, he dislikes. He is not fond of this motive because of the motive of the picture as a whole, because the composition, even in the later, more ecstatic versions, comments on both versions, but he's most interested in this one, keep the image in the fetters of Renaissance tradition, as he claims. At a certain point, he writes, looking at the National Gallery painting, he involuntarily started to mentally imagine how to ecstasize the disappointing image. He says that he would change the, and it's a long description, and I'll just pick a few remarks. He would change the horizontal format to vertical one. The arch in the background would frame the whole top of the picture. The figure of Christ would have to hang over, and I quote here, the other characters. The figure to the left of the Christ would have to be presented completely on its back, overturned, smitten with amazement, and all the other figures would ecstatically contort in their response to the figure of Christ hovering above. In addition, both Christ and the figure of man on its back, still invisible, would have to burst out of their clothes. The result is, he writes, something like the resurrection from the grave. Stop. Indeed, just what we sketched is actually reflected in the mortal resurrection from the grave, in the most complete ecstatic manner of El Greco. Two pictures, and I'm still quoting Eisenstein, of which the second actually seemed like an explosion, into which the first burst along the line of its basic features. End of quote. Eisenstein created a montage of two paintings as if combining two film scenes or film takes, just to generate an effect of an ecstatic, pathetic outburst, potential in the expulsion and released in the resurrection. Eisenstein's bringing the other picture into play activates this transformative energy of the differential virtuality located in the painterly forms of the withheld potential of the expulsion, and actively combining the two images in the viewer's in his mind. And now I jump a little bit. The developments in the technologies of the 20th... Oh, sorry. The developments in the technologies of the 20th century, from the invention of cinema to relatively new computer-based imagery, created varied ways to make a variety of aspects of the virtual visible. While in some accounts the onset of reproduction distanced viewer from the presence of the object, which famously lost its aura, it also offered a rich laboratory for revealing the extended virtual field of artworks. For André Bazin, and I quote him, it is in pulling the work apart, breaking up its component parts, in making an assault on its very essence, that the film compels it to deliver up some of its hidden powers. End of quote. What film and other reproductive technologies offered was providing the viewers with ways to visualize diverse virtual dimensions underlying an actual artwork. Especially the genre of art on films envisioned imaginary horizon of the art of an artist, which informed the resulting work of art, or the layering of a work of art in its temporal, processual extension and scenes showing the creative process, a phantasmatic sphere of the abstract or the unconscious which coagulated in a finished material artwork. A good example can be experimental films on art by Paul Hassert, or for example Polish artist Józef Robakowski, or art videos such as Bill Wyler's Emergence, just one example of many. The latter was triggered by an extended reflection on Mussolino's Pietà, which secularizes and universalizes that theme. The video becomes a laboratory of differential play of memory, association, and resulting meanings, which develop the virtual as a transformative proposition. Weiler says that, well, after his first experience of the Mussolino's picture, he sort of like puts it aside and let the memory sort of fade and transform and somehow germinate into the resulting the video project. The avant-garde, especially constructivist cult of material and the resulting reification of an artwork seem to have prescriptively neutralized the virtual, contained it, leaving the object on its own. It was nicely grabbed a little bit later in Frank Stella's formulation, what you see is what you, is what you see, where seeing was restricted to the perceptible and perhaps touchable object with no further extensions. Even though in principle the fetishized materiality or objecthood of, in this case, minimalist artwork imposed strict restriction to the domain of the virtual, space and time, as well as space and time, the material coordinates for the movement of the body around these objects introduced perhaps the virtual dimension. The dematerialization of an artwork announced in relation to the much discussed during this conference in relation to the art of the 1960s by Lucy Lippert meant that to simplify the argument, we've already talked a lot about that, meant that the matter gave way to an idea which had to be, however, somehow signified in language and through artistic gesture, or a seemingly marginalized object. An idea, as Joseph Koszut claimed, equaled its other ways of being rendered, for example, in photography, or equaled a material object, was as good as a material object. Again, certain simplification for the sake of brevity here. Also, well, so art became blind man art, or non-visual art, with incidental visual appearance, as Solowitz put it. In view of the above presented argument about the virtual, which combines the virtual with the experience of a specific object, it would be a stretch to say that conceptual art fully grasped the realm of the virtual. This is also because the virtual is rather unpredictable, subjective, and elusive rather than logical, rational, or calculated. However, we could say that while in work of art based on a material visual structure and the virtual played a kind of a supplementary role, conceptual art, and I again risk certain simplification, reversed this relation, making material and visible elements supplementary to the domain of the invisible idea. The invisibility prominent in the conceptual art in the so-called, well, again, media art or new media art, based on new communications and computing technologies, gain an excessive visual and multisensory, even if immaterial, exposure. Recording and storage of memory data and of memory as par excellence virtual sphere was also outsourced to diverse prosthetic devices such as digital photography and data banks. The increased virtualization of the world was considered by Deleuze liberating. And as Harris put it, the computer revolution has made the virtual a place of experimentation and innovation, end of quote. Computational imagery and transfer of information not only enabled unrestricted visualizations of the virtual, memory images, combinations of diverse elements of reality with the fantastic, with the imaginary, and so on, but also created a chance to virtually navigate and perform these virtual landscapes, still in the narrow sense of the virtual proposed here. In her work, Domestic, an American artist, and many other works by her, in fact, an American artist and academic, Mary Flanagan, using a popular game engine, reconstructed her traumatic childhood experience of a burning family house. Distorted proportions of spaces, text, and photos convey the creative differential work of the virtual in action, virtual bound up with memories generated by her psychological apparatus. The viewer, or in fact the participant, can navigate and interact with her memory and apply different so-called coping actions. So you can interact with this within this landscape, of this interior. A Hong Kong artist, Alan Kwon, in turn, constructs a representation of his memory in an interactive, game-based environment through making available to the public navigating it his everyday activities recorded over a period of many months by a head-mounted camera and regularly uploaded to his ever-expanding work. These elements here are so-called houses in which he stores images and videos recorded on by a head-mounted camera. So they are stored and can be accessed in different houses scattered over a vast, navigable, gloomy landscape. In this way, the virtual became its own subject, a paradoxical subject of virtual technologies, opened for the audience, visualized, and thus, to a greater extent, intersubjective. And I want to close these remarks, scattered, but maybe at least somehow showing the potentiality of the virtual, so to say, with a thought by Michael Hein, a scholar of virtual realities, who noticed a paradoxical condition of virtuality in contemporary culture. And it's a longer quote from him. Virtuality vanishes with its own success. When successful as a transparent platform for activities, virtuality attains invisibility in the culture that adopts it. When it functions square perfectly with human desires and gestures, virtuality is absorbed and something virtualized becomes a reality within the culture that constructs it. The more virtual things become, the weaker the meaning of virtuality. Therefore, end of quote. Therefore, it's perhaps interesting and refreshing to think of and restitute virtuality in its potential state, look for it in objects and in material objects and images, even if the virtual often leads us to astray expected paths and complicates predictable findings. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Filip. So the last speaker in this panel is Eric de Bruyn, who is coming to us from the University of Leiden. He's assistant professor in film and photographic studies in the program. He's assistant professor in the film and photographic studies program at the Center for the Arts and Society at the University of Leiden. He writes about media theory and contemporary art theory. He's published books about film, video art, post-minimalism, and photography. He has several research projects going, including media topologies, I can't see very well today, including media topologies, which concerns the genealogy of topological structures, models, and strategies in modern and contemporary art, conceived as a study of prehistory of the network imaginary of the 1990s. And he also has a project called the Filmic Anomaly, which discusses a set of key film exhibitions and film practice. His talk today is entitled Disappearing Acts, Moments in the History of Dematerialization.
Let's see, where am I? These are very small icons.
Yes.
I'm looking for Cracow. Oh, here. Almost there.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Slightly altered title, Vanishing Acts, but comes down to the same thing more or less. Both the same magical trick and a bit of a political dictatorial trick as well, but I won't talk about that so much today. This talk has, in its current form, 3 parts. If we have time to get to the end of it, I should say that in its longer version there are 4 parts, which ends on this more political aspect of Vanishing Act, which has to do with this wonderful film by Hito Steyl, How Not to Be Seen, which deals with actually the disappearing of people. But I'm not going to quite make it that far. In any case, I want to start first with a part which goes over some terrain that might now be all too familiar for us, but I'll return to this question of dematerialization as it's been raised by Lippert or Lippard. I actually know 2 ways of pronouncing her name. I don't know what is actually at this moment current. And this will connect then also back to what Pavel was talking about earlier, which is nice because I would have liked to engage you early on, but there's no time for that. And I'll maybe show a little bit more of a dystopian look into the virtual in relationship to the former talk. Okay. During the exhibition, I will try to communicate telepathically a work of art, the nature of which is a series of thoughts that are not applicable to language or image. In 1969, Robert Barry proposed his so-called telepathic piece for a group exhibition at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver. Organized by Seth Siegellaub, the exhibition showcased the work of a group of young artists who, for better or for worse, would become known as conceptualists. Rounding up the usual suspects, Siegellaub included, besides Robert Barry, Terry Atkinson and Michael Baldwin, Jan Dibbets, Douglas Hubler, Stefan Kaltenbach, Joseph Kossuth, Solowitz, the NE-Thing Corporation, and Lawrence Wiener. An all-male roster of names, which will sound familiar to anyone who has studied the history of British and North American conceptualism. And I have to admit that my beginning Vanishing Act is a bit myopic and very much focused on New York. Although these were no more than loosely associated and at times even antagonistic artists, I warn any of you never to bring Kossuth and Lawrence Wiener into the same room. It was Solowitz's famous paragraphs on conceptual art of 1967 and the various enterprises of Seth Siegellaub as gallerist and curator that perhaps contributed most to the emerging notion of a conceptualist movement. However, it was a female critic, Lucy Lippard, who proposed one of the key, if problematic, terms with which this movement became associated, publishing the essay Dematerialization of Art in early 1968, which was co-written with John Chandler. So far, I've simply reiterated the familiar facts to set the scene. My purpose here is not to dwell upon Lepard's thesis that art was entering a so-called post-aesthetic stage, leading to the emergence of an ethereal idea art in which the thinking process, as she called it, has become paramount, and the art object is on its way to becoming, and this is Lepard, wholly obsolete. Barry's telepathic piece is one among many of this period that appears to support this argument well. Nevertheless, several so-called conceptual artists were among the first to point out that their exhibitions were far from being emptied of stuff, but rather displayed a clutter of photographs, objects, written and printed text, and various storage and filing devices. Lepard's notion of dematerialization, which in the 1968 essay is strongly associated with the introduction of new media technologies and contemporary arts, noting the breakup of traditional media since the late 1950s with, as she says, the introduction of electronics, light, sound, and more important, performance attitudes in painting and sculpture. In fact, it is a film, Michael Snow's Wavelength, which provides one of her main examples, even though this very same film, only a year later, would be championed by P. Adam Sidney as a prime example of late modernist avant-garde, which he identified as structural film. Later, Lepard's dematerialization thesis would undergo a further degree of politicization, reconceiving the ephemeral and informational status of the art object into critique of the commodity status of the art object. If there's nothing to see or touch, there's nothing to sell, or so the reasoning went. However, we all know how faulty that logic has shown itself to be. Under current conditions of economic financialization, dominated by the abstractions of fictional capital, it has become overly clear how the production of physical goods no longer provides an essential link in the circulation and accumulation of monetary value. In fact, we've entered a wholly new stage of speculative capitalism, which is not only having its impact on the contemporary art market, but on contemporary art practice as well. What was lacking, therefore, in the critical strategy of dematerialization as espoused during the later 1960s was a properly apparatical understanding of value production within the institutional circuits of art. It is this that Benjamin H.D. Buchloh, among others, would rectify by introducing the notion of institutional critique a little bit later on in the 70s, a notion that was strongly informed by the work of Marcel Brothaers, which you've heard about yesterday, which infested the gallery space with myriad slide and film projections, yet certainly did not dematerialize the work of art in Lepard's original sense of the word. But in the light of such criticisms, why then return to Lepard's original sense of the word? Why return to Lepard's notion of dematerialization at all? What's more, why take up the example of Barry's telepathic piece, which seems emblematic of Lepard's proposition in all its reductiveness? Let me say, first of all, that on rereading Lepard's essay in preparation for this conference, excuse me, I was struck by the analogy she draws between art and mathematics. One of the highly eclectic sources that we've heard also yesterday of her text is Joseph Schillinger, who Lepard herself describes as a minor American cubist, but was in fact a music theorist of some fame during the 1920s and 30s, who wrote an equally ambitious as hefty tome called The Mathematical Basis of Arts, which was published in 1943 after a labor of about 23 years, I believe. It is on the basis of this extraordinary book, as Lepard calls it, that she envisioned the impending disintegration of art in the abstraction and liberation of the idea. These are again her terms, borrowing from Schillinger. According to the grand pseudo-Hegelian scheme of the mathematical basis of art, the intuitive sensuous practice of art will be transcended in a rationalized mathematical understanding of the world. Schillinger foresaw that at the logical end of a continuous process of abstraction, the human mind will be reduced to an electrical circuit in the same fashion that music will be formalized by mathematical patterns. And this is Schillinger. As physiology becomes a branch of electrical engineering in the study of brain functioning, so aesthetics becomes a branch of mathematics, end quote. Whereas this prediction has shown itself to hold at best as a partial truth, it nevertheless indicates a pressing reason to take up the examples of Lepard and Barry once again. Let me note to begin with that since the 19th century, a striking, often intimate relationship has existed between, on the one hand, scientific developments in the field of physiology and media technology, and on the other hand, a widespread interest in the paranormal and spiritualist phenomena. In short, it was the tele in telegraphy and television that was seen by many, including some very respected scientists, as equivalent to the tele in telepathy. Namely, the power of technology to render distances in time and space immaterial. Call it, if you will, the spectrality of media, which may conjure ghosts on the screen or even seemingly in real physical space. Indeed, Karl Marx famously invoked an early media apparatus, the phantasmagoria, to describe precisely the paradoxical nature of the commodity as a sensuous, non-sensuous thing, part abstraction, part object. The commodity as specter, or what we also call a real abstraction. Are we to conclude, therefore, that Barrie's telepathic piece was meant to be ironic? Barrie's own attitude towards the work is highly ambivalent. He has spoken of his fascination by the phenomenon when he discovered it in the 60s, even stating that, and this is Barrie, it was probably a very natural occurrence many thousands of years ago, end quote. Whereas the modern mind has built up defenses against it, he says. But he has also declared later in life that the notion should not be taken all that seriously. The question of Barrie's sincerity actually is neither here nor there, as far as I'm concerned. What's more interesting is the use of telepathy as a metaphor, not only of the immateriality of information, as if a message has no need of a material support, but also of the techno-scientific notion that media themselves are a force of dematerialization, which will ultimately dissolve the physical interface between the mind and the world, reducing both to an interplay of pure algorithmic structures. And I think it's time for another image. And if this sounds too much like science fiction, one has only to return to the latest project of Elon Musk, called Neuralink, which is developing, and this is from their website, ultra-high bandwidth brain-machine interfaces to connect human and computers. Or this is a project that's by Facebook, which says we're way too slow in typing, so they want to remove the typing interface by a form of mind typing, so you tap directly into your brain waves and you can communicate with your computer directly. Or even using the epidermis of the skin as a means of communication. So this is a kind of a weird linguistic theory here in which a language is going to be reduced to sort of physiological impulses, which means that I can think in Spanish and you can receive my message in French by means of your skin. You don't even have to use Google Translation anymore, is their idea. By means of a cranial implant, that's with Musk, but Facebook hopes to avoid that, Musk hopes to make it possible to download and upload thought, thus accelerating the output of the human brain. So here you have it, we have 4 HD movies streaming per second in our mind, but when it comes to output, actually physical output, we slow down to a 1980s dial-up mode. So typing apparently is not fast enough. Neurotechnology would, according to Musk, allow us to remain the masters of artificial intelligence, but it is equally probable that we will have to make room for a corporate soul housed in our minds. In sum, the process of dematerialization, as signaled by Barrie and Lepard at the end of the 60s, has taken a very different direction from what they anticipated. So what if we now return to the 60s from this new perspective? What kind of genealogy of dematerialization might we construct? Part of the problem thus far is that the notion of dematerialization has not been considered in a sufficiently dialectical fashion. What, for instance, does it mean, circa 1970, to oppose material to immaterial modes of artistic practice? And secondly, how does such a dichotomy compare to other seemingly related dualisms, such as optical versus tactile, visibility versus invisibility? And what precisely is it that becomes invisible or non-tactile due to the presumed dematerialization of the medium? I shall first lay out how such dualistic terms structure the discursive field of conceptual art, before then proceeding to question how these same dichotomies operate in a very different fashion in contemporary art. So back to Barrie. Robert Barry initiated his career as an abstract painter of the hard edge variant, but made the transition to the dematerialized practice of conceptual art by way of a short stint as experimental filmmaker between 1967 and 68. Or perhaps it's better to call him a structural filmmaker, as he worked together with other filmmakers such as Robert Hewitt, Hollis Frampton, Michael Snow, and Joyce Wieland, who were soon to become known by that label. Here, for instance, is a faded copy of a film program of April 3, 1968, organized at Hunter College by Bob Hewitt, who was also a former painter. The program included such early films by Frampton as Process Red, of which I'm showing two stills, which is characteristic of the self-referential, medium-specific approach displayed by all five filmmakers in drawing attention to the visible signs of editing, such as tape splices and frame lines and punch lines, and the material surface of the film strip itself by scratching, for instance. It would not have been immediately clear in which discursive context that Hunter and Vet could be situated. On the one hand, the films can be, and by some of the participants were meant to be, read as exponents of a late modernist movement in film, equivalent to the already existing modernist movement in painting, which had recently culminated in the works of Frank Stella, who, as we just heard, famously declared, "What you see is what you see." A rather blunt statement that the formalist critic Michael Fried, would translate into a loftier program for contemporary art. Fried, like his mentor Clement Greenberg, liked to consider painting as consumed by a desire for sublimation. According to their program of late modernist aesthetics, the emphatic material presence of the painting was to be subsumed within a radiant state of pure disembodied opticality. The art object, in short, was to be dematerialized in a burst of abstract luminosity transcending its concrete surroundings. And this dialectic between the concrete and abstract, of course, was given more literal reading or more literal turn by Lippard when she talks about light art as being the beginning of dematerialization. In light of this background, it should come as no surprise that the early paintings of Barry and Hewitt received a warm reception among formalist critics. Note, for instance, the absence of all human touch in their paintings, which makes them appear to be the product of an automatic technique of fabrication. It's this absence of the sense of human touch that amplifies their autonomous quality. In short, the instantaneous and total visibility of these paintings, what you see is what you see, depends on the prior strategy of invisibility. That is to say, the removal of any trace of the artist's subjectivity. As Fried would argue, that indexical trace of the human hand would only cloud the immediacy of the painting to the viewer. Within late modernist aesthetics, visibility, presentness, and automatism operated as analogical terms. Which is why Fried agreed with his friend Stanley Cavell when he wrote in The World Feud that, and this is Cavell, the succession of automatic world projections in cinema created an experience of presentness for the spectator, which was similar, both thoughts, Cavell and Fried, to the beholder of modernist painting. In short, the formalist discourse of late modernism established a quite different relationship between painting, film, and dematerialization than Lippard did. The former clearly were not willing to declare the medium of painting obsolete. Nevertheless, it has become clear how late modernist painting had prepared the vanishing act of Robert Barry. That is to say, his conceptualist strategy of dematerialization. But only if we acknowledge the dialectical twist that has taken place between late modernism and conceptualism. If late modernist painting attempted to render the institutional framework of art, along with the very stuff of representation, invisible, Barry, like other conceptual artists, wished to draw attention to this very context, going so far even as to display the basic material support of modernist painting, the empty white cube itself. At the same time, if the early paintings of Barry and Hewitt might be read in modernist terms, it's not necessary to do so. And here lies the crux of the matter. These same paintings could also be understood to emphasize the literal physical presence of the work, which is why, for instance, my reproduction of Barry's painting of squares needs to include the shadow cast by the thick stretcher onto the wall. In fact, Hewitt would designate shadows as the immaterial substance of his work in the later 1960s, whereas very square paintings would begin to include the architectural ground, the physical wall of the gallery, as part of that pictorial field. Another take on the Fra Angelico, I guess. These works deliver us to the pivotal moment in the later 1960s when a modernism is transformed into its other, namely not a dematerialized but a highly materialist practice of site-specific art that draws attention to the contingency of its own situation. Whether we call this conceptual, post-minimalist, or situational arts doesn't really matter. What is crucial is that the viewers no longer remain invisible before this type of work. They are neither immersed within it, immersed within it as in a video installation, or they are actively summoned, as it were, by the artist who is keen to communicate his or her thought process. Barry's assumption of the role of the telepathic medium, therefore, has to be understood in this interrogative or even interpellative manner as well, and not only as a phenomenon of dematerialized idea art. So what I've done now is try to extract a sort of constellation of dichotomies from this field of late modernist and conceptual art practice, dealing with terms like material, immaterial, visible, invisible, abstract, concrete, optical, tactile, embodied, disembodied. And what I want to do now, as long as our moderator will allow me, is to investigate how these same dualisms operate in the present. And for that, I have selected two contemporary works which expand and transform the conceptual scope of these terms, raising questions of a more overt social-political nature. So my first example is by an American artist based in Amsterdam, actually, Zachary Fornwald. And there was a bit of a preamble, which I'm going to skip here, in which I wanted to go with this question of problems of representation, of originally capitalism, famous problem in the 20th century, of course, but particularly in our current stage of post-Fordist or control society. How is it that one can represent our current informational networks? And there's been a discussion going on between people like Van Scheer and Alexander Galloway about the different approaches to that, mapping out the networks or trying to, as we were discussing yesterday, visualize the glitches within the system. But I actually prefer to approach this from a different way. So I'm going to save you that, spare you that, sorry, and go on with Zachary Fornwald's In Light of the Ark, which is the third film in a series about 3 stock exchanges: the Shenzhen Stock Exchange built by Koolhaas, the Burlage Stock Exchange in Amsterdam of the early 20th century, and the mid-19th century Stock Exchange in London. But I'm only going to focus on one work of this series, which is about Shenzhen. It consists of a 2-screen installation that at the outset juxtaposes the shot of the workers in the interior of the Shenzhen Stock Exchange with an image projected on the opposite wall of a joint being welded by means of electrical arc. This seemingly arbitrary detail will, in the voice-over of Fornwald, open onto a fascinating meditation on the relationships of light and darkness, visibility and invisibility, as they are distributed within the capitalist system of industrial and spectacular production. And let me just, even though this is really going to bite into my time, show you a bit of this film, just give you a sense of what it looks like. Same problem as yesterday, I guess. Let me get this to run. Is it not making the link?
It's in the file, yeah?
Well, it should be in the PowerPoint, but I can run this from here too. Let's hope this is the right one then. Is it not?
It works.
Yeah. Can we turn up the sound somehow?
Ah,
the sound is very low. Okay. No, I got it.
It's on. It's not connected with.
In 1801, a luminous discharge of electric current connected two pieces of carbon that were attached to a battery.
Lower the volume.
As the pieces of carbon were slowly pulled apart, a light in the shape of an arc unfurled between them. This shape of the light led the man carrying out the demonstration to call the phenomenon an electric arc. Sparks are one thing, instantaneous flashes of light and heat. They seem to disappear as soon as they are formed. But an arc can be maintained. It can be controlled, directed and used in a way that sparks, in their fleeting moments of existence, cannot. A spark may or may not be the beginning of something else, outside of itself. An arc, on the other hand, is itself something. It is light and it is heat, and if there is enough power behind it, and the conditions are right, it can last a long time. After its first appearance in the early 19th century, the electric arc remained out of sight to most until something could be developed that would provide the power, the electricity, needed to maintain it. When that finally happened, half a century later, the arc became the first electric light. The light from the arc was so bright that it was only used outdoors, in public spaces, as street lighting, as well as inside factories. It illuminated both public spaces and those spaces which Marx had famously described as the hidden abode of production.
So the electric arc produces a dazzling brightness that also has a blinding effect. In order to see the scene, the welder must wear a mask, making everything but the immediate task invisible. On the construction site, the brilliance of arc welding is a pure excess, a waste of energy, but elsewhere the searing light becomes productive. Arc lights not only provided artificial illumination in 19th century factories, speeding up the process of capital accumulation, but they also, in the shape of cleat lights, lit up the first movie sets. In fact, cleat lights were not only intensely luminous, but also emitted harmful UV rays, causing anonymous workers of early cinema to wear sunglasses, an historical index of early industrial labor, which would later become transformed into an empty symbol of the Hollywood star system. The arc light is an allegory of invisibility, or visibility if you will, which provides Formold with an entry into the grand general theme of three exchanges, namely the opposition between the brightly lit surface of so-called efficient and rational marketplace and the material sphere of production that it casts into sheer impenetrable darkness. One story that is presented by In Light of the Arc is how the radiant, unfocused brilliance of the arc light becomes, as it were, concentrated and directed into the fiber optic network of electronic trading. The film methodically approaches the very threshold or outer limit of what can be represented. What lies in the shadows is not just some kind of material substructure that is concealed below the surface of market exchange, but a kind of latency, a constant background of noise which the media system of financial capitalism seeks to suppress but can never completely control. The space of financial power resists easy access. Obviously, this is a question of representation. It will not give up its secrets easily. Not only is there no material product to show, but there is also very little physical activity to follow. Particularly since electronic trading began to replace the trading floor, it's on here. The light has come washed out my slide. If you look very closely, you see a couple of sparks flying there. Particularly since, no, it's okay, the other slides are going to be much brighter, so it will be fine. But, yeah.
You're about at time now.
Yeah, I understand. Particularly since electronic trading began to replace the trading floor in the later 1980s, the boisterous face-to-face activity of open outcry trading has been silenced and replaced by the humming of computer data centers. Algorithms, not human interaction, are what drive the high-volume, high-speed nature of contemporary financial markets. There's literally almost nothing to see, and that which remains visible has become inaccessible. But the heart of the contemporary stock exchange consists of row upon rows of black boxes connected by miles of data cables pulsing with infrared signals. What is there left to illustrate, Formwalt notes, if the actual trading occurs beyond the threshold of human perception? What, in the light of the art, dramatizes precisely is this inability to obtain a complete overview of the capitalist system, to situate ourselves within its dynamic flows of tangible and intangible commodities. So I've got a page to go. Because I'm going to leave the final example for another time. In the Shenzhen Stock Exchange, the visual language of allegory appears to come up against the final limits of abstraction. Formwalt quotes from the website of OMA, the architectural firm that designed the structure in 2006. This is OMA. It is a building that has to represent the stock market more than physically accommodate it. Due to electronic trading, the Shenzhen Exchange has no need for a trading arena. All that remains is a purely ceremonial space where the entry of a news company onto the market might be celebrated in front of an assembly of the financial press. A bronze bell hangs in this hall that can be rung to start the trading day. Perhaps the bell ceremony, Formwalt suggests in his voiceover, has taken the place of Mercury or some other god of commerce, to make a kind of play on the role of allegory here. This hall is located in the most peculiar feature of this building, a so-called floating base. OMA, it appears, wants to transform the whole building into an allegory of financial abstraction. And this is OMA again. In other words, Cracow. As if it is lifted by the same speculative euphoria that drives the market, the former base has crept up the tower to become a raised podium. Lifting the base in the air vastly increases its exposure. In its elevated position, it can broadcast the activities of the stock market to the entire city and coalhouse. For all its declamatory style, however, this is an architecture that wants to make itself invisible. This robust exoskeletal grid of the tower, read in the same text, is overlaid with a patterned glass skin. The patterned glass reveals the detail and complexity of construction, while creating a mysterious crystalline effect as the tower responds to light. A clearly articulated grid reflects its surroundings, but in doing so, Formwalt observes, it renders its surroundings mysterious, and a strange lighting effect replaces the structure. And so, we are asked to consider how this architecture is located in the gap between two boxes, one formed by the exoskeletal grid and one by the black box of the computer. One that we are permitted to see and one we are not. And ultimately, this gap is nothing less than the fissure between the world we inhabit and the prices that project it. One type of noise, as Three Exchanges has shown, did vanish. The sound of the open outcry, the shouting on the trading floor that was necessary to transmit a signal, the correct price, amidst the confusion. Yet disappearances, as in Light of the Ark maintains, are often just a form of displacement, quite in contrast to the myth of an efficient market, which is based on a notion of total information. Electronic trading has developed new strategies of concealment. Large trades, for instance, will be broken down fractally so that no other trader can see the whole, which appears, as Formwalt notes, as 1,000 tiny reflexes rather than a single coordinated movement. I mean, the software is trying to outwit other software programs. If you want to dump your stock onto the market, you have to do it in little bits so that other software don't actually recognize that you're trying to offload your stock. So it's a whole kind of cat and mouse game of algorithms at this point. in which we don't even play a role. The problem then becomes how to distinguish single from noise, and I'm coming to my final conclusion, or in between conclusion here, but for now. The medium system begins to run into its own limitations. The greater the resolution of the image, the more distraction or disinformation occurs. Thus, the camera, in light of the arc, zooms ever further into an LED screen on display in the ceremonial hall of the Shenzhen Stock Exchange until the very texture of the screen itself becomes visible. This texture, Format notes, is but noise, but it is also what holds the image together. So I'll stop here, and if you have time, and we all have planes to catch, I was going to move on to something which I kind of brought up yesterday in relation to your talk, which was liquid crystals. As another example of trying to mix these dualisms of material and dematerial, optical and tactile, with these kind of images, and particularly note how this finger is actually causing the screen to bulge, it seems, but that's the result of static energy that is being fed between the finger, the touch, and the screen. This is a video by the Volatile group called Anathema, and it's a compilation film based on all kinds of advertising for liquid crystal display screens, and make kind of a collage out of that. Anyhow, so I'll keep that in reserve for another time. Thank you.
So we still have time for questions. We deliberately started at 9:15, so we're kind of, if you look at the pamphlet, we're 15 minutes behind, but that's fine, right? We have enough time. Okay. Thanks for those terrific talks. I'm sorry I had to cut you off and be mean. Who has a question first? Who would like to ask the first question? I'll come to you with this thing. I don't like the over the field. Sorry.
Thank you very much for all three talks, which were wonderful. Of course, I can totally agree with Professor Monika Wagner that all formulas of dematerialization and immateriality or immaterial, it always requires somehow the matter, or indicates the matter, or it's always related to the matter. So that was very important, and all your talk was somehow very important contribution to our discussion, because of these references to the Bauhaus and pre-war period as well. If I may, I would add one more name and one more figure to this picture. I mean Alexander Scriabin and his theory of synesthesis in music, and especially his Prometheus, the poem of light from 1910. I think somehow it was prophetic for this whole concept of light and glass, which was of course very important for 20s and 30s then. And I would like to thank you to Eric because of this because you brought this theory of fetishism by Marx. It's somehow it's also very, very important to this dialectics of matter and what is matterless or immaterial. And I mean this paradoxal status of commodity in capitalist society is a core concept, I mean, to understand this duality and the tension between, and it was always in my mind when I was doing my research. I didn't pay that much attention to this in my talk, but but somehow the problem of alienation which occurred in my paper was, of course, inspired by this theory. Thank you very much. Actually, it's not a question, it was a comment, and a grateful.
Do you want to comment first, or shall we just go to Filip, the next question? Does anyone-
Hey, I just have a quick comment on Professor Wagner's talk. Thank you very much. And it just made me, it's more like a comment than a question. It made me think about, when you talked about dust, about the case of Ai Weiwei, who this sunflower project for the Universe series at the Tate Modern, where dust was an offshot and a sort of a something which actually, you remember that he scattered the millions of sunflower porcelain or ceramic sunflower seeds. And of course, it was not, I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, but when people walked around, it was not intentional actually. Yeah. So when people walked on that, and there was the idea, it started to generate this dust, which when inhaled, it was very dangerous for people's health. So actually, the dust sort of annihilated the whole project because they had to get rid of those sunflower seeds. So it's like the sort of an offshot, and a kind of an interesting offshot of the whole thing. And I was also wondering if you thought about, because this is the dust and smoke are the so-called dirty immaterial elements, but so could we think about, like, for example, Olafur Ellison's project as clean immaterial, I don't know, works, when he uses steam, for example, where this kind of a variety of, well, you could say counterparts of those contaminated substances. Well, not really immaterial, but elusive or ephemeral ones. And one more, when the question of dust was addressed by a variety of scholars who, on the one hand, sometimes talk or write about art, but also are interested in post different, let's say, in bioart, also different kinds of post-humanists, so to say. A colleague and friend of mine from the philosophy department, Monika Wagner, published a text in Leonardo called Living on Dust, around the globe of mineral particles and microbial hitchhikers, which might be an interesting bibliographical reference. You can actually get it on Academia Edu. I think it's downloadable, so just it might be something to follow to develop certain parts of that argument. So, thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. I have to continue because I don't know this last point. I just wanted to make sure I did not mean that cleanliness, visual cleanliness, could not be unhealthy. That is something that I would not put together. But the visual cleanliness was for me just a sort of foil, something where you could contrast the dust word.
Sure.
And I sort of concentrated on the 80s and 90s where this memory context was active. And I think that the Ai Weiwei piece is later, and I think it's a very interesting point. I know the work, I have been there. Mm-hmm. And yeah, thank you very much. I deliberately excluded steam. Steam is something completely different.
Yes.
It concentrates, so we had learned about that yesterday already, on certain contaminations in the air, but it is water and it dissolves in a completely different way. And of course that would be interesting in the 60s with Morris and when he, there's one piece he installed in Pittsburgh in the airport, which is not that known in comparison to the other steamwork. And that is really, really interesting because it connects to the aircrafts. But I deliberately excluded the steam from the dust.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks very much. Okay. Yeah, and thank you as well. I mean, there are many about the 1920s. I think it's a big project of modernity to come to this transparency.
Yes.
But I think it's very interesting how these notions shift, because I try to mention that dematerialization was only one of the words that was used. And but after the Second World War, when many of the people who were immigrants to the United States published in English, then the notion of immateriality and transparency, which was not a notion before the war, became prominent. Before the war, and most of these published in German, they claimed that it was Durchdringung, which is something completely different than transparency. And I thought that is interesting, especially in connection to architecture, because it means something completely intertwining, not only looking through, but
going through also.
Yes, and it's
physically. Yeah.
Yes, physically, and it's materially much more active.
Interpenetration, right?
Yes, something like that, in a physical sense.
Well, I'm feeling less and less like I have, like I'm from far away in the past, but I would like to raise again the issue of crystals, since I was invited to do that. And I'm reminded that all this seems to be, speaking of ghosts, like the ghost of Hegel, the idea of the death of art and the dematerialization, which seems to have very much to do with that, seems to be a kind of variation on that theme. And then if the incarnation is the beginning of the new subjectivity in the modern Western person, and then Riegel, when he talks about the history of art, describes the art of Constantine as crystalline, and this becomes a theme. This becomes a theme writers after him, as the crystalline is peculiarly modern. It is the abstract as opposed to the empathetic, and it does seem to me like a harsh idea. I've never thought about it in terms of dust. In terms of dust, there's dust and dust. I was struck yesterday. When we heard the proposed fate of the Brandenburg Gate. You pulverize it, which means make dust out of it, and then somehow suitably commemorate the reason for the destruction. And I was struck by, on the one hand, you have the death of art, which is something people are making computer images. What are we going to do? The painters can't paint anymore. There's that kind of attitude on the one hand, and then on the other, you have a dematerialization that's related to real world historical catastrophes. I mean, dust had such importance in the 20th century, and we have Auschwitz, when the dust of Auschwitz must have settled over Cracow. We have Hiroshima. We have the whole sort of transformation of the ideology, or not the ideology, but the iconology of dust is so powerful in the 20th century, to the degree that it bears on whether an artist lets dust gather in the studio or not, and whether that qualifies as something of interest. This, to me, there's a kind of in all of these discussions, there's been two extremes of the significance of dematerialization, and this pattern is followed to my mind, in the treatment of the idea of dust. I'd also like to say that as I say, I feel this is a very slice of contemporary criticism. This has become more and more that. But in my Real Spaces book, there's a chapter called Virtuality, which is very different from what you're talking about. And I'll just say that one of the authorities that you cited, my old colleague Keith Moxey, we used to argue about this all the time.
Really?
And I thought that he was absolutely dead wrong.
He was dead wrong.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was dead wrong.
Follow-up question? Sorry, were you going to?
No.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, I was also interested in what you're saying with virtuality. Of course, as you're very well aware, I mean, there's some kind of a slippage here between Bergsonian, Deleuzian reading of the virtual, and the fact that there's a technology that also becomes known as virtual. And Deleuze wasn't really around to kind of comment extensively upon that.
It's for the cinema.
Yeah, but he's not really taking on the technology of cinema there so much, in the sense that we have to do with the digital.
Oh, sure.
I mean, Beyond the Control Society essay, that's kind of his one statement. But I was wondering, and also when you were talking about, an art historian like D.B. Kugelmann that likes to develop this kind of mental dialogue with the painting. Translating that back into technological terms, you're probably very aware of this image recognition software that is around this time, that is now even entered into art exhibitions, because it's not functioning properly in the sense that it's been trained to recognize faces and animals in anything. So you can take a photograph of a shopping mall, and in the shopping mall also you see these fantastic creatures appearing, because the software is translating that back into facial patterns. So the question really here is, what exactly, because at some moments during your talk you talk about something that formerly would have been called projection. Leonardo looking at the damp stains in the wall and seeing images in there, Max Ernst looking at the headboard of his bed and seeing in the wood patterns all kinds of fantastic creatures appearing. And so in a way, this also relates back to dust, because it's a kind of way in which, with our slip into the virtual, there's also the question of control that starts emerging. Another kind of way of talking about dust today is to talk about intelligent matter and nanoparticles, and it's not just about the fear of contamination, but the idea of colonizing dust, controlling dust. Anyway, the question for you, first of all, about the relation to projection.
Okay. Especially because the landscape of the meaning of the virtual is, as you noticed, quite diverse. And when it comes to projection, like in the case of Leonardo, or actually the book that I quoted by Dario Camponi, Potential Images, is that there is. So you see, or you imagine, or you anchor your perception in certain images that are out there, material, and then you sort of develop a kind of a mental projection. Yeah, that's it. And the virtual is not just something which is a layer over something which like which covers. Yeah, or which creates this sort of completely new layer, a new screen. But as Deleuze emphasize, but other scholars, differential quality. So it has to, what is important is that it has to serve it has to be a differential combination of the actual and the virtual which the actual sort of generates, or the material which, the visual which generates this sort of a projection, which can be visualized, for example, by artists, or it can be just a sort of a mental experience. So it would be I think it's a valid and possible to think about it as a projection. It's always a kind of a mental projection, but if you want to translate it into the contemporary media art, that would have to, it couldn't be just a projection on, like a, let's say, blank surface. It has to be combined with what you perceive or what you experience in one way sensuously somehow. So, I don't know. It's not just a plain projection on like something that comes out from one source. There's this sort of synergy between the object and the subject. So, I don't know if you meant that or not.
But I mean, for Deleuze, it would also be a question of individuation. So it's also a sense that one is, projection is very much from a sort of state of relative self-consciousness, whereas the virtual will be the loss of that sense of self or subjectivity.
Well, it has to be, it is somehow externalized, but it is always subjective, and he says that, and it's the sort of the source of newness and subjectivity, and it's subjective in both ways, in the sense that it comes out from the subject, and it's subjective because, well, it's not very often, it's not very intersubjective, so to say, so conveyable in this understandable manner. It's a source of distortion as well, or it's a source of kind of a differential transformation. So what I'm saying is basically, but it has to. It's not just coming. There's no point of origin in the subject, just in the subject. It has to be stimulated or activated by an external experience, perceptual, tangible, or otherwise. So there is this sort of a two-way, at least the way I read it. So projections, if you translate it into contemporary art practices, which use projections in a variety of ways, you know, it's not just a simple. It's not just a simple practice of projection like here. There should be, I believe, a kind of a double kind of a or multiple exchange, rather than just something coming out of the projectile, so to say.
I'm being told to wind down, and I'm dying to make a comment about the Fra Angelico, so I can save it or I can make it. I'm glad you brought up transparency and also projection too, because this Fra Angelico, I guess we can't see, we can just project in our minds what it is. But, the business of transparency is quite important, I think, in the 15th century. When you think about projection in architecture, Brunelleschi's forms, how you're binding form through architectural space, right? You've got the white walls in contrast with the Pietra Serena that can be projected into infinity. It's just a site on the grid, basically, that he didn't execute the way exactly he wanted to. But if you take those spaces and multiply them out, you end up dematerializing, if you will, the entire form. And I think what you just said about the dependence on subjecthood and subjectivity, rather, is really important too. And I mean, if you just think about the form, I'm not going to quote 15 texts, but if you think about the form and the manner of representation of the Fra Angelico, what it's for, you know, what the context is, and what the disappearance of that wall is doing in relation to the intended function of meditation. Because if you look at the wall behind Gabriel, there's a shadow there. I mean, it's a really interesting shadow, because it's not clear if it's Gabriel's shadow, if it's Mary's shadow, if it's the monk who's standing. I mean, now I'm just remembering, but it's exactly that interdependency between that presence, because I do think it originates in the subject to some extent, and especially, I mean, and what better comment on dust also can you come up with than the original, you know, in the Western tradition anyway, you know, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. I mean, this is the whole focus of the rituals of humility in that context. I mean, not to get all historical, but that's important, you know, we can. So there's dust in that Fra Angelico too. Anyway, thank you. I should shut up now. Thank you.
It's a nice conclusion. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust. The whole conference.
Now we have the